Good afternoon and welcome to the Festival of Urbanism 2020. This afternoon we'll be talking about active kids and rethinking transportation. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we Zoom, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge this always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. We're very lucky this afternoon to have two guests with us, Bridget Foley and Lindsay Reese. So I'll go into introducing them and then we'll do a bit of a conversation about their work in active kids. So Dr. Lindsay Reese has extensive experience in applied research and evaluation, specialising in physical activity, sport and public health. Within her current role as Research Fellow at the University of Sydney's School of Public Health, she is the Academic Director of the Sport and Recreation Intervention and Epidemiology Research (Sprinter) group at the University of Sydney and Chief Investigator for the evaluation of active kids. Bridget Foley is dedicated to improving public health through the promotion of physical activity and reduction of health inequities. Bridget has research and evaluation experience working with policymakers, NGOs, businesses and practitioners from a range of disciplines and sectors, including education, health, urban planning, media and sport. She's currently a Senior Research Officer and PhD candidate with Sprinter. Her PhD research focuses on evaluating the effects of the New South Wales Government's statewide universal Active Kids Voucher Program. And this is part of our Charles Perkins Centre lunchtime talks. Just as a reminder to everyone, you're all welcome to pose your own questions in the Q&A panel of the Zoom webinar. So feel free to just pop your questions in there and we'll get to those after our conversation with our two researchers. So first off, Lindsay, would you like to tell us about the Sprinter Group and the research you do with the sports sector?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having us here. We are very delighted to be here this afternoon. And full marks for getting the acronym right. So we go by Sprinter. It's a full title, which is why we kind of go by Sprinter. And that's how we're widely known. And essentially, Sprinter is a sport and physical activity research group here at Sydney Uni. We specialise in working with the sport and physical activity sector. And our primary aim really is to enable all communities to become more physically active through sport. And we do that by delivering very high quality policy-focused research, and we also do a lot with the sport and physical activity sector directly also. So Sprinter started back in 2016, and we have a policy-focused partnership with the New South Wales Government Office of Sport. And that was a really exciting flagship partnership for the University of Sydney. I actually spend a couple of days a week over at the office pre-COVID. So it really is a collaboration and it's a very exciting one. So we've been very proud to have that. We work directly with the sport and physical activity sector, so community sport clubs, Sport Australia, and really it's all focused around how we can understand how we can engage more people to be physically active, but also explore some of the health and wellbeing benefits associated with participation. So our work is very broad, it's very exciting, and we're very proud to be a part of Sprinter.
Wonderful. And so you encourage people to be more physically active, and one particular program focuses on kids. So one of your flagship projects is the evaluation of the Active Kids program. Can you tell us more about that and your involvement?
Yeah, so that alludes to the significant partnership that we have with the Office of Sport, and our work really through the Office of Sport is very broad. We do a lot of work with the Women in Sport strategy, we do a lot of work with some of the regional areas, but Active Kids is by far a big priority for New South Wales Government at this current time. Our involvement within Active Kids was very exciting that we're there right from the outset when the Minister announced the Active Kids programme was going to start. And it really, I guess, is an example where academics have worked in partnership with policymakers to inform the design and delivery of a government programme. So our role really is to provide the research and evaluation associated with Active Kids. And for those people that are not familiar with Active Kids is a statewide voucher programme. So, and I'm sure many of us around here actually maybe signed up for a voucher. So every child in New South Wales can access up to two $100 vouchers each year. And that's really targeting increased participation in sport and physical activity, but also helping families reduce the cost barriers that we know are so prevalent when accessing sporting opportunities in the community. So it's a statewide voucher programme, and our partnership is to lead the evaluation, and we've done that since 2018. so several years now, and it's really given us some great insights in terms of the behaviours of New South Wales children, with it being such a universal programme. Because to put it into some context, there's 1.2 million children in New South Wales.
Wow.
So the sheer size and scale of this programme really is phenomenal. And what that's enabled us to do is really embed research into this government programme to understand more about physical activity in sport.
Yeah, so the comprehensive evaluation that Sprinters put together for the Active Kids program draws on a couple of different sources of information. So one is when a parent or caregiver registers a child in the Active Kids program, they complete an online registration form. So through that, we collect information about the child, like their sex, socioeconomic status, through their postcode, their date of birth, their Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander identity, whether they speak a language other than English at home, a really comprehensive set of demographic information that typically in the sports sector, all of those elements are not collected. And we also capture their physical activity and sport participation before they registered for a voucher, so that we can look at some impact and some changes over time. Another element of the evaluation then on top of that is that we have a prospective cohort study that then follows those kids after they register, that indicate whether they're happy to participate in research. And then we follow them up twice per year with an online survey to look at more detailed information about the impact of the voucher, how it's changing their sport participation, but also impacts on their health and well-being and their weight and different other characteristics over time. And then there was another aspect which we probably won't go into much today as well, but we're also monitoring the providers, so the impact of the voucher program on the sports sector. All the sport and active recreations organisations who register, it's a really broad range. So it ranges from, like, I guess, your typical sports like your football and your netball and your soccer. And then there's more active recreation like your rock climbing and scouts, and then also organisations like dance and gymnastics and every range of organisations, trampolining. So it's really good to be able to also do some qualitative work with those providers, and go into that in the evaluation that Sprinter's doing.
Wow, that's so interesting. Is there like a most popular sport with the kids these days?
It definitely with the kids. It definitely ranges. I mean, obviously the seasonality of sport is quite common, but I think one of the advantages of this program from the evaluation perspective has been the breadth of activities on offer. And I think that's something that we're committed to within Sprinter, is understanding the broad benefits of sport and really starting to think about almost redefining what sport means. Still, so often when we think about sport, we think about the more traditional AFLs, football, soccers, and we also think more the elite end. Whereas actually when you start thinking about community health and well-being, it's really about enabling access for all forms of organised sport. And that's one of the advantages that Active Kids has had, is that it's really opened up the breadth of providers there. So just as Bridget's mentioned, you've got trampolining, circus skills, dance, a whole range of activities. Dance and recreation is certainly more popular with girls. You certainly see some traditional sports more popular when the registration's open, so the summer sports like cricket. So there are definitely still some ingrained trends there. But I think that breadth of activities really helped us understand actually the benefits of sport more broadly, which I think is a really powerful message.
And so the objective is to increase access and participation. Have you found that the program is reaching everyone?
Yeah, so the Active Kids program, I guess the sheer size and scale of the program is a world first. It's a program like this has never been done at this scale. And we've done some research into the reach of the program, looking at comparing it to the census and the people who've registered in the Active Kids program. And the reach is substantial. So we've had more than half of the eligible New South Wales population, which is kids from about school-age kids, so 4.5 all the way up to 18. So 53% of those in the first year. And then as the program's continued, more and more of the eligible population have been registering and participating in the program and making the most of the $100 vouchers that are available to them.
So we've definitely seen that most children within the state who are school enrolled and aged between 4.5 and 18 have been accessing a voucher. We still see there are some communities that require support to access a voucher, but credit to the Office of Sport, who are the leaders within the government agencies for who lead the programme and who deliver the activities through the sports sector. They've done an excellent job of really trying to raise the promotion and awareness of active kids. We do know, though, from other research that when people are accessing different forms of sport and physical activity, it isn't always equal. So children that live with a disability, children from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, children from disadvantaged communities, we know that they require additional support to be active. I think, like anyone, this universal program is one step to helping people access the opportunities, but like with anything, we still need to make sure that there is support on the ground to do that, and that's something that the Office of Sport really takes seriously and they're leading on.
Yeah. And one really exciting thing that we've seen through looking at the reach of the voucher program in New South Wales is that the program is actually engaging kids who are not meeting physical activity guidelines. So 19% of kids who register are achieving the guidelines. So you can see we've got a big range of people who are taking part and registering for a voucher and using it to participate in different types of structured physical activity programs. And they're actually people who need to be more active as well, which is a really great thing that we're seeing.
And so how has the Active Kids program, that from what you've seen, helped you understand the impact of COVID-19 on kids' physical activity?
Yeah, we couldn't be here and not talk about the impact of the global pandemic, could we? I think, like I alluded at the start, because of the sheer size and scale and reach of the Active Kids programme, more than we've seen before, we've been able to understand about the behaviours around physical activity and sport of children in New South Wales. So the way I sometimes like to look at it is this is an opportunity to learn more about children and learn more about how they access sport. Because of that opportunity, during COVID, we have the cohort that Bridget alluded to. We have a significant cohort of over 100,000 kids each year that we like to talk to. So when we sent out a survey this year, we added in some questions to understand what impact that COVID-19 had had. So early this year, obviously, community sport was postponed under the public health order. So we saw a cancellation of many activities. So what we wanted to understand was actually what other activities they might have been doing or how physical activity levels were affected. And we did that through the surveys. And what we did see for the first year, so obviously we've got a couple of years data now where we've seen increases in physical activity for people that have a voucher. This was the first year where we did see self-reported declines in physical activity. So that showed, and it's not rocket science, that obviously as a result of the impact, children's physical activity levels went down. We also added in some questions around screen time, because that's a bit of a proxy for how much children are actually sitting down or doing what we call sedentary behaviour. And we saw that went up. So again, not rocket science, and won't be alarmed to anybody, but it just showed us that actually COVID has had an impact, but also that active programs like Active Kids present a very unique opportunity to actually support children to become more physically active. And interestingly, in July this year, the creation number of vouchers, so the number of people that went on and created a voucher, was higher than even the first year. So we've seen a huge increase in the number of people accessing a voucher. So that once again shows the reach of the programme. And I think going forward, that will be an interesting point to look at.
Yeah. And when we added those questions into the online survey, we also added in some sort of free text fields where people could tell us and explain a little bit more about why those declines have happened. And as you would expect, the main response was around the cancellation of sport and postponed and things not being able to be accessed. But some other really key things that came out were that even when kids were at home, they were less motivated to be active because they weren't surrounded by their peers. Right. So we know that children are really motivated to be active because of the social element of sport and other activities. And we found that parents were saying that the kid just wasn't interested in doing something if they had to do it by themselves. And because some activities might have changed to be doing things online that people can access, or not voucher activities, but like any other things that parents were drawing on to be able to get their kids to be active at home. And another thing that a lot of the parents reported in the survey were that the level of the intensity of the activity was a lot lower when they're online. There's a lot less space in the home to be active. They haven't got a whole football field that they can go run around on. And without that social element, the aspect of fun and enjoyment was missing. So we really saw that fun and the lack of the peer really changed the children's enjoyment of the activity, and that resulted in them being less active. And then when it comes to screen time, a lot of parents were saying that the blurred lines between when school online education changed and then things were moving more to when they're still wanted their child to be active. Still wanted their child to be socially active and talking to their friends, even though they were in isolation, but that was all online as well. So that screen time just built up, and it's really difficult for families to monitor that and to now try and shift back to getting them back into that screen time regime where kids are getting less than 2 hours a day, ideally.
I think to really sum up the question, though, it's kind of saying that what COVID has really taught us from a physical activity perspective is that communities still need support to be active, and people access sport unequally. And I think we did know that before COVID, and we now need to make sure that we have concerted efforts to tackle that inequality. So for me, if anything, it's just reinforced behaviours and trends that we had seen before. And it's probably a bit of a call to action for us all to make sure that we do integrate sport and physical activity within our communities more than ever.
And so given that the theme of the festival is making better places, and of course increasing that physical activity is all part of that, what do you see as a way to rebuild that and to sort of support sport and community post in the COVID-19 recovery?
One of the really great things that we asked families that as well in the online survey, and they were saying that actually the Active Kids voucher was a really great initiative to be able to get them back out. So some quotes were around people who've lost their jobs, so they don't actually have the money that is required to register in those activities at the moment because of the impacts of COVID. But then by having that voucher there, they were saying how much that's a really huge help to getting back out and getting the kids out of the house and active again. So the financial support is definitely a huge one that's going to be helping people from all different walks of life to get out and get active again.
Yeah, and I think anyone that observed, living under restrictions could see that once you're being told to stay indoors, the first thing you want to do is go outside and get some fresh air. And I know near where I live, there was people outside on the streets. We saw it busier than ever. So when we think about public spaces and how we use it, I think actually we all observed people using their local communities probably more than ever. And I think it just reinforces the importance of having that space to be active, whether that's in an organised capacity, whether that's being able to travel to take the kids to school, or whether it's being able to travel yourself to work. So I think for me, it was just reinforcing that sport and physical activity really is a powerful tool that we all need in our day-to-day lives. I think more than ever we know that health and well-being, especially our mental health and well-being, is really key, and we know that the ingrained evidence around physical activity in sport can play a beneficial role there. And I think for Active Kids going forward, it's to continue to make sure that people have access to the vouchers, and we continue to promote, and we continue through the research to actually understand more about how we can support people to be active, and also use those findings to then inform and enhance the programme delivery going forward.
And more broadly as well in the sports sector, one of the really interesting things through COVID is that necessity of having to do something differently during COVID has really driven innovation, and seen sports organisations doing things in a completely different way that they would have been doing it before because they had to. And I can foresee that we won't go straight back to exactly how things were done before as well. Some of those innovations are going to stick. People are going to be having more flexible options to be able to access things online when they aren't able to go, or they're worried about attending as things are starting to return back to normal as well. So the innovation, I guess, that's coming out, led really by the organisations who are really wanting to work with their communities and get people engaged, is really exciting to see.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. It's very it's a nice optimistic note to wrap up with. But we're going to move into audience questions. So I invite you again to type in your questions in the box. But we have one we prepared earlier, actually from an audience member. So here's a scenario for you. We have an inner city family. They live in an apartment building. mum and dad, have caring obligations on the weekend, and dad has a job on Sundays at the supermarket getting the Sunday rates. And so it's a lot harder for the kids to be, taken out to a sport or to the playground. There is a playground nearby, but it's mostly targeted at little kids. And this child is, let's say, around 11 or 12. So quite independent, but probably needs a little bit of supervision. And mum and dad don't feel entirely comfortable with letting them run off on their own. So how do we support public places and spaces for kids to use that don't necessarily need to be tied to mum and dad schedules or ability to fund more activities? What do you think?
Well, I mean, Bridget's got some additional thoughts on this. I think I'll probably tackle, not the question, I'll probably tackle a lot of the context in the question, which is actually referring to the chaos of just daily life. And I think what that really alludes to is that physical activity and sport very rarely is a priority. And we have so many other things going on. And actually what that question is talking about is how hard it is to actually achieve, your 30 to 60 active minutes every day. All of us have got different bits going on, whether it's work, whether it's family commitments. So for me, what that really speaks to is what we're trying to do at a much broader global level around really trying to integrate physical activity day to day. And trying to build it in where you can. And I think it really does speak to how difficult this is, which is why we have programs like Active Kids, why we have other, programs focused more on adults. And I think globally, we're trying to do that through research and evaluation, looking at, I guess, as a much bigger system rather than just focusing on kind of direct events. So I know that doesn't directly answer the question, but I think overcoming parental fear about letting a kid in the playground isn't, even if you have the answer to that, that's not going to solve the bigger questions for physical activity more broadly. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the open spaces too?
Yeah, well, I just guess just to add to what you've said there, like we are obviously, well, my PhD specifically is working very much on the Active Kids voucher program, but it's just one intervention. And we really need a really comprehensive, multiple component suite to actually be able to help that example that you've given, help that child get out there and achieve the 60 minutes of physical activity that they need to be getting each day. And it's, so we could talk about it all day.
we literally could talk about that all afternoon.
But yeah, modifying the environment is really, really key. And I think that, we've seen a lot of examples in that from our research as well. So kids are more likely to be active if they can get out and be active with their friends, especially as they're getting older and more independent. So being able to get together with friends, and also, I guess, in terms of solving that issue, involving that child in the conversation and being like, how can we actually get you out on the weekend because your parents are busy, and empowering that child to have that self-efficacy to be able to get out there and do it. Through the voucher, we've seen that kids who increase their physical activity, increasing their it's helping increase the physical activity of kids who didn't have that self-efficacy. So it's getting that, building that self-efficacy in children,
definitely,
which is so important to be able to get out there. But if you have an environment outside your door that is unsafe and not well lit, and the pavement is cracked, and there's interesting social situations going, of course we're going to see that. And that's why we really need to work with those communities to improve that environment and make sure things are really targeted towards the most disadvantaged communities to get the biggest bang for buck as well.
But I think you hit the nail on the head. There's not one single solution to physical activity. And I think the Active Kids program also is not trying to be a panacea to solve everyone's issues with physical activity. It also recognises that traditional, formal, organised activity isn't for everyone either. This is, again, one platform. So I think it really is one solution. From a research perspective, I guess what we're trying to do is use it as a platform to understand a lot more about people, how they choose to move, what their barriers are. We have the assumed barriers of cost and time, but actually there may be other barriers that are very specific to some communities. And I'm sure whenever we have questions around Active Kids, it's always, what are the other options, or how cost is the main barrier, but what are the other barriers? Well, one of the opportunities that we have within this evaluation is to actually understand what local New South Wales barriers are. And I think that's where we're trying to use the research to inform that going forward.
Great. Okay, so we've got a few questions. So from the evaluation, can you see benefits of the program equitably distributed? For example, are physical activity benefits accruing mostly to children who are already physically active and or from high income households?
So I think the big thing to start to reinforce on this question is that based on the universal nature of the program, all parts of community are accessing the Active Kids program. Everyone is creating a voucher, right from the advantaged communities through to the disadvantaged communities, but we would be incorrect if we said that was equal. People that live in disadvantaged communities are accessing the voucher at a lower rate than the advantaged communities. But the universal nature does mean that everybody is accessing the voucher. Like we've seen this year, 66% of children in New South Wales are accessing a voucher that are eligible. So that's the real first thing to mention. I think Bridget also alluded to the fact that most people that access a voucher, about 80%, are actually physically inactive when we look at the physical activity guidelines. So that just shows that the sporty kids, which I guess the cynics, and I was probably one of them, do kind of say, is this program only reaching sporty kids? Even if it is, it's still not necessarily active kids. So what we do know though is that everybody that increases their physical activity levels from whatever base you start receives benefits, but we do know the biggest benefits come from those that are inactive. So I think it is a positive that majority of kids that access a voucher at the registration are physically inactive. But Bridge, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that for the activities that kids are using the voucher on, we're finding the vouchers being, or about 40% of the time that they're doing an activity is being supported by the voucher. And in terms of annual cost, because it's interestingly, with the universal voucher, it's the same amount of money, right, that everybody gets, but it's supporting it about 20% across the board of how much people would be spending. So the more affluent people are going to be spending more money, but the activities that might be chosen by people in more disadvantaged areas would only ordinarily be spending less, but it's still supporting a similar amount of their annual spend on physical activity, structured physical activity program, which is great.
Yeah. Sort of linked to what you were talking about sporty kids and not necessarily active kids. We had another question. They've disappeared, but I still remember it. How for those who organise sport isn't necessarily their thing, how can we support other kinds of activity like playing cricket, football in the street, just with the neighbours, and supporting sort of that activity?
I mean, I think that's talking to the broader topic about how we just integrate physical activity into our daily lives. And I think Active Kids is one part of the solution. We've alluded to the variety of activities that are available. Any provider can apply to Officer Sport to become part of the Officer Sport program too. So if there is providers in your community that you want to use your voucher at who are currently not registered with Officer Sport, then the community can speak and actually say, why don't you look at exploring registrations? That's one opportunity. But I think what this is talking about is physical activity promotion more broadly. And that's where it comes to having a whole of system, multi-sector approach, whether that's looking at schools, whether that's looking at active travel, whether that's looking at, integrating within healthcare. There's a whole range of things we can be doing. But that's, Active Kids is just one part of the solution.
And so we'll wrap up quickly, but I've just got two more questions. I might roll them into one. Has there been data found on engaging teens or older teens in sport who had not previously been engaged at a younger age? And the last question, was there a surprise? What surprised you the most about the research that you've been doing?
Oh, I love the surprise question. That is a surprise.
For the older age groups, there has been a lower uptake of the voucher because typically as kids get older, we know from global research that they're likely to drop out of activity. In terms of people who are using the voucher to start a new activity, we have seen a lot of people in that older bracket saying that they want to start a new activity using their Active Kids voucher.
I'm still working on the surprise one.
Yeah, the surprise one's kind of fun.
For me, and this probably sounds really negative, but I'm British, so I'm a cynic. The biggest surprise for me was actually the number of kind people who, when they register for a voucher, agree to receive one of our surveys. Because in this day and age, you'll get bombarded with information. So my biggest surprise was the kindness of New South Wales community and if anyone on the call or listening in has actually filled out one of our surveys when they've registered for an Active Kids voucher, I will extend an extra special thank you, because without people responding to our surveys and without people engaging in the research, we wouldn't have the knowledge and insights that we do. So that was probably one of my
100% the best one. Yeah, but I guess I would say that when before this all started, I guess we were all wondering how it was going to go, and when you look at other examples from overseas where a similar kind of program might have been run out, not as universal as this one, but the uptake has been tiny. Like in a disadvantaged community, they literally have 1% of the population signing up, whereas we've got 50% of the population. Like the difference in terms of the engagement of the community in this program has been incredible.
Yeah. And this is a world first.
Yeah, wow.
It really is.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for joining us, Bridget and Lindsay. It's been lovely to hear about this really optimistic research, I think, and I look forward to reading more as the evaluation goes on. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And
thanks for joining.
Yes, thank you everyone for staying online, and we're moving on to our next presenter. So Associate Professor Melody Ding is a Heart Foundation Future Leader Fellow and a Sydney Research Accelerator Fellow. Melody is internationally recognised for her work in physical activity, behavioural epidemiology and chronic disease prevention research. She led the 2016 Lancet series on physical activity and health, and was the recipient of the 2018 New South Wales Young Tall Poppy of the Year and 2019 Eureka Prize Emerging Leader in Science. Melody is committed to improving population health and well-being through promoting health-enhancing lifestyle, environments and policy. And we're welcoming Melody remotely. She'll be up on the screen. There we are. Hi, Melody. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll just make sure that your audio is on as well. Can we hear you? Okay, we can see that Melody's talking, but she might be muted. The joys of Zoom. Okay, I think we're unmuted.
All right, yeah, for some reason at first it says that I couldn't unmute myself.
I think it's the
Thank
setting.
you for having me, and a COVID-style conversation.
Exactly.
Straight from my room.
So let's get into it, Melody. You've been doing some research on driving and health. Can you tell us a bit more about the health effects of driving?
Yes, so even though driving has been an important part of our life for quite a few decades, it's actually not until about 10, 15 years ago that people start to look at the link. I think the first paper came out around 2004. Primarily exclusively focusing on the link between driving and obesity, for example. And later on, so I used some Australia data and did one of the first comprehensive research in terms of a range of lifestyle outcomes and risk factors. So my research has found that prolonged driving, so I define that as 2 hours or more a day, has been linked to a range of related health issues such as obesity, lower physical activity, less sleep time, and even higher risk of smoking and much higher psychological distress, for example. So that is very interesting for me in terms of seeing such a consistent pattern and quite dose responsive. So the more you drive, the more health consequences we observe. And that is even after we're taking into account of any socio-demographic characteristics, because there is confounding at the geographical level that people who tend to drive longer hours, for example, possibly live in a more disadvantaged neighborhood. So we try to account for all of that, and we still see very robust results. And that study actually inspired me to try to find out a bit more about, exactly what is the mechanism, through which driving affects our health. And we did a very interesting cross-disciplinary research study. So that I work with people who work in physiology, and we get our volunteers to drive during peak traffic hour on Parramatta Road from Sydney Uni to Ashfield. And many thanks to the participants who are willing to do that. And we measure a range of stress biomarkers, and what we found was that driving elevated heart rate and decreases heart rate variability. So these are both markers for acute stress. So when acute stress has been repeated over time, that become chronic stressor, and then that's when we start to worry about further health consequences down the track. So this is my research. This is more directly related to driving health. But when we look at, there's a lot of indirect effect as well. For example, the exhausts are linked to air pollution. The engine noise is related to noise pollution, and we have very concrete evidence on how air and noise pollution are bad for our health. Traffic related injuries is also one thing. And also when we think about if everyone drives, that creates this car dependent environment. So that creates a vicious cycle that discourage other people to walk and cycle. So there's a lot of indirect harms to our health and our society.
Car dependent environments. So personally, I hate driving. Like, I just think of my car as a death machine. But what does a car dependent urban environment look like, and how dependent on cars is Australia in the bigger scheme of things?
Yes, very good question, Nancy. I wish you participated in our study. You'd like to see how your heart rate responded to our driving challenge. So the way I think about car dependent neighborhood design, it's kind of, it when you see it. So when you see the neighborhood layout, basically the concept is prioritize driving. So if the neighborhood design mainly has driving in mind, so that is the design feature that prioritize driving, and sometimes it's exclusively for driving. So when we think about neighborhoods with wider roads, like multiple lanes of traffic, limited or poor quality footpaths, and fewer intersections, and high speed limit, and also in terms of urban design, to have a lack of what we call land use mix, so that we have destinations far away from the residential neighborhood. You have to drive to a local shopping mall for all your shopping needs and to run your errands. So this is a very typical kind of car dependent environment. And in Australia, because I'm quite fortunate to live in fairly walkable neighborhoods, I have to say that it's quite difficult for me to name a suburb, but I used to live in the west coast of the US, and basically nearly everything was car dependent, and it's actually not a standard practice for roads to have footpath next to it. So walking could be quite dangerous. So that is car dependency. But on the flip side, we can also talk about, what we want, because I think, when I was talking about the features of car dependent neighborhoods, a lot of the audience here are probably already imagining these neighborhoods that just look ugly and undesirable. But on the flip side, we have other design concepts such as, walkable neighborhood, and sometimes it's called new urbanism. Sometimes it's called traditional urban design, because when you think about European cities with good street connectivities, like oftentimes grid patterns, so you can start from A to B via so many different alternative routes, and land use mix. So we have everything linked together. We might have apartment building upstairs, but shops downstairs, and street calming. So usually that involves, roundabouts, speed bumps. So any sort of street calming attributes to reduce the noise and the speed limit on that street. So this is often called traditional street design, because that is a concept that was how people have been planning towns for many years, basically before there was such thing called automobiles. And so now we're trying to go back to that traditional way of designing that. So it's also called a new traditional now. So we're seeing this trend, and seeing this being more and more emphasized and valued in cities around the world. So I'm really hoping that this is where we're not heading, not the car dependency.
And so So we saw a period where during of course the pandemic, when we were all sort of locked down and staying at home, there was a lot higher use of cars when people were avoiding public transport. But now that everything is sort of slowly easing back to almost normal levels, what kind of alternatives are there to driving?
There are many alternatives, and I think that is actually something. It's a good segue from some of the questions asked to my colleague Bridget and Lindsay, and because we're talking about physical activity here, and it's very important for us to conceptualize physical activity as something that is beyond sports. Because some of the questions were about, what if the students, the kids are not interested in organized sports. Physical activity basically involves any body movement, and whether or not that's for the purpose of health and fitness. So sports are, usually organized. It's for fun, it's for health, it's for fitness. But there are other ways to incorporate active living and incidental physical activity into our life. For example, walking is the most obvious one. It's free, it's accessible to nearly all, and it basically requires minimum planning. And the problem is you travel for shorter distance because you're traveling at pedestrian speed. And cycling, it's something that I probably want to spend most of the time talking about, because I really think that is the way of the future when we think about our planning. And some of the Sydney street here, cyclists can go possibly the same speed as cars. So we can go much a longer distance, and it's very good for your health and fitness, because it's oftentimes considered at a vigorous level if you pedal at a decent speed, and you emit zero, carbon dioxide, except for your exhalation, and there's no emission, and it's very low cost, and I really think that's one of the options for the future. But let's also not forget about public transportation. And this is something that is a bit of a sensitive topic at the moment, because a lot of people see risk of infectious disease, whether or not it's COVID, with years to come related to public transportation. And I think that is definitely something we have to take into account when we plan for public transport in the future. But conceptually, public transportation, if it's well planned, it actually provides opportunity for us to have incidental, sometimes lower intensity physical activity as well. So, for example, studies from the US has shown that after a light rail station has been built, they put accelerometers on people who live around that area. So just because of taking light rail, people get 16 minutes more physical activity a day. And that's really substantial, because the WHO recommends for 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week. And then if every day we do 16 minutes more and 5 days a week, so that is already 80 minutes. So you're already like more than halfway into meeting the required physical activity.
So you mentioned you're a cyclist, and you love talking about cycling, and kudos to you, because I would be terrified to cycle in Sydney. How does Sydney shape up in terms of cycling? What's your experience of it, and where can we draw examples from to continue to improve that system?
Yeah, so I moved to Sydney at the end of 2012, and so I think cycling as my main mode of transportation. I don't own a car, so for the last 8 years, and I've definitely seen slow incremental improvement in terms of cycling infrastructures. I've seen more and more bike paths, and I've seen more bike parking, and I've seen more separated bike lanes, and which I really enjoy using. And I think, I start to see more of the street signs for cyclists as well. So I think all of these are happening in the right direction. But to be honest, I still consider riding in Sydney quite a dangerous adventure. So my current commute is about 40 to 45 minutes each way to uni. And it's actually quite rare if I, for a long ride of say an hour from the start to the end, if there's no moment that makes me feel like, oh, what is this person doing? Oh, that person's getting really close to me. So that kind of happens almost on a daily basis. And a lot of my experience, I think I related to drivers not being patient enough with cyclists, or drivers sometimes might not actually have very good understanding about the cycling, about the traffic rules related to cycling. For example, the idea of passing cyclists with a meter of distance, I see that violation pretty much on a weekly basis. And the idea of the cyclists are actually a vehicle that can take up one lane, it's something that many drivers just have no understanding about. You know, they just like to hunt their way through to make sure you get out of the way, and they pass you with very small margins. So that's actually quite a common experience. And I really wish it could be a safer environment, so that people like you, Nancy, will be encouraged to cycle, not to be scared of cycling in Sydney.
Do you think that there are exemplars that we can draw from? I mean, I've cycled in Copenhagen, and that's amazing.
That is amazing.
Yep.
Yes. So anyone can cycle in Copenhagen. That's kind of my experience. So before the COVID time, I used to spend a bit more time, traveling overseas, and usually, if I were in a place like Denmark or the Netherlands, I would rent a bike and just kind of live the locals' life. And it's just so easy to ride there. And of course, we have to consider that there are other issues. For example, Copenhagen or Amsterdam, they're both very urbanized cities. They're very densely populated, and these areas, people have a long tradition of using bicycles as their main mode of transportation. And particularly in the Netherlands, they have bike lanes everywhere, and low speed limit. Generally, cars don't travel very, very fast in the cities, and people have a good understanding of treating cyclists with respect and as a legitimate vehicle on the road, because everybody has cycled at some stage in their life. And sometimes I just stop and marvel when I was traveling in these cities and looking at some 70 years old grandma traveling on her bike with her little red dress, or some 5-year-old riding somewhere on his bike on his own. So this is all part of the culture for any age and fitness level. So, I mean, of course, that would be the dream for cyclists. But I understand that we have different geography. Sydney is a lot more hilly than Amsterdam, for example. We have different, I guess, cultural heritage when it comes to cycling. And we have different skill level, possibly. Not everyone has ridden a bike at some point in their life. But we can see recent success stories from places like Portland. Portland in Oregon is really, has been studied as a textbook example of successful planning initiatives that really prioritize cyclists. So Portland has, in Portland, more than 6% of the commuters commute by bike exclusively, and in the US in general it's 0.5%. So that's something, if we make that commitment, that can really happen.
I just have one last question for us to wrap up, and I'm just going to throw that open to the audience again to pop in your questions in the Q&A panel. And I think a lot of researchers, including Lindsay and Bridget, have mentioned that the pandemic has been seen by a lot of sectors as a point in time to sort of leverage the situation where we can do things differently and make change. What do you see as what we can do to improve transport in light of what we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, I really hope that COVID is a catalyst for us to transform the cyclability of the city. I think there's already a lot of progress happening. We've been seeing pop-up bike lanes, and some of them will become permanent, because I don't know if you guys have heard about it in the news, but bicycle business is doing really well amidst COVID. In the UK, for example, one of my friends wants to start cycling, but she was telling me that you have to pre-order a bike and wait for 5 months for the bike to be delivered, because everybody wants to get on a bike now, because they think that, look, I can't use public transport anymore, and I don't want to drive, and I really want to give bicycle a go. And I think that is really an opportunity we have to capitalize. And in the long term, we're unfortunately also seeing more people replacing public transport with car use. So this is a good opportunity for our government to think about, what do we want to prioritize in the future? Do we want to prioritize more cars, thinking about 20, 50 years down the track, or do we want to really set up a legacy for Sydney or for New South Wales in general in terms of having a range of transportation options for people? How do we incentivize that? So we really need political commitment, because to me, cars are really the 20th century's transport model. So we really have to think ahead in terms of what sort of future we want.
Thanks so much, Melody. Now we'll throw it to the audience and we'll see what questions we have in the Q&A. Here we go. So a couple of tips from Adam. The City of Sydney runs excellent courses to make you more comfortable riding in Sydney traffic. Thanks, Adam. And also, electric bikes can also improve the safety issue. That's true. A lot of my friends and colleagues have purchased electric bikes, and that certainly helps with the hilliness of Sydney.
So that is definitely something that I want to encourage as well, because that gives you options. It's still good for fitness, and you can turn it up and down to see how much of your leg power you want to use. Yeah. But for longer distance and for the trips that you don't have a shower at the end of your destination, that will be a really good option.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. So could electric assist bikes help to... Oh, yep, okay, that's already been answered. Yes, we just chatted about how handy they are. And Alice says, do you think more shower facilities will encourage people to ride the bicycle more? In your experience living in Europe, do they provide public shower facilities? That's a great question.
That is a great question. I also actually thought about it. So the change really needs to happen at multiple levels. So just now I was mainly trying to speak to the policymakers in terms of the political will and how we want to develop as a city. But there's at the organizational level, having a safe place to park your bike so that people don't have to worry about bringing their bike here and worry about their bike being stolen, and shower facilities so that people can really put themselves on a bike and come here, especially in Sydney summer, and to have a shower at the end. I think that is super, super important, because no matter how willing someone is, and no matter how much we improve the infrastructure, if you are going into an important business meeting at the end and you don't have shower facilities, then there's very limited options for the people.
I think that also applies for if you're coming to work and going to the gym on the way as well, and that certainly would encourage that kind of activity too. Another question is, do you think the public bike system should be operated by government and provide 30 minutes free so that bikes can be used for the last mile journey? I think Harrison might be referring to those yes. bikes that you can rent on the street and then sort of leave at another day.
Yeah, so we actually evaluated public bike sharing in Shanghai. So that's where these kind of Mobike, and at that time OFO, these kind of bicycle sharing mobile bicycle sharing company started. So in China, we definitely saw this program as being very successful in terms of just getting people to, particularly for bridging the last mile, because a lot of our participants were the ones who live possibly 2-3 kilometers away from a major train station, a metro station, and previously they were driving because they just didn't want to walk that distance and takes too long, and now they're using that to exactly as a way to access to public transport. Unfortunately, we didn't get to evaluate the initiative in Australia. We were in the process of doing that, but then the company went bankrupt. So from my reading, that at least the mobile bicycle sharing system has not been a success in Australia so far. So it's not been accepted and used at the same level that they have been used in China. So I think seeing new electric bikes sharing popping up at different neighborhoods right now. So I really hope that people value this as an opportunity. And I don't know, to be honest, what the government can do in terms of providing incentives and discouraging vandalism, because that has been a huge issue with the bicycle sharing companies in Australia. There's a high level of vandalism.
Okay, great. And a last comment from Pat Fitzpatrick, great name. Great to hear you championing cycling as a lovely way of combining fitness and transport/commuting. Thank you so much for your time, Melody. We've learned a lot, and I, might consider doing a bit more cycling than usual, but maybe just on like the roads around my house, not on the big roads.
Sign up a workshop.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Melody, for joining us. It's been great hearing from you, and we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And so I think that wraps it up from the studio here today. Thanks everyone for joining us. The festival is still running until the end of this week, with our last event being the 8th annual Henry Halloran lecture. And you can register for free tickets, all online, all on Zoom, so you can come along in your PJs and a cup of coffee at festivalofurbanism.com. So thanks so much again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.